Imagine you've been dropped into the middle of the Australian outback. Not the postcard version with a tour guide and a chilled bottle of water. The real one. 45 degrees Celsius, red soil, sun that feels personal. A horizon so empty it looks like the world forgot to finish rendering this part of the map. Everything that crawls, swims, or flies seems designed by a cruel engineer. Venom, teeth, spikes, hostility. It looks like a place where civilization should fail. And yet right under your boots, there's money. An obscene amount of it. Wealth buried in layers. Wealth that doesn't care how poetic your culture is, or how innovative your startups are, or how elegant your political philosophy sounds. Wealth that only asks one thing: can you dig? Because despite having a population smaller than Texas and a landmass roughly the size of the continental United States, most of it uninhabitable desert Australia isn't just doing okay. It's a financial juggernaut. For nearly 3 decades, from the early 1990s until the pandemic shock of 2020, Australia pulled off something that feels almost illegal in modern economics. It avoided recession. While the US imploded in 2008, while Europe tore itself apart in slow motion, while Japan spent decades drifting through a deflationary fog, Australia just didn't break. It kept moving, kept growing, kept getting richer. And that richness isn't just GDP charts and politician speeches. By median wealth per adult, Australians have routinely ranked among the top 2 or 3 richest populations on Earth, beating the United States, Germany, France, the UK's, sometimes sitting just behind tiny financial microstates, depending on the year and the methodology. This isn't a poor country that got lucky once. This is a system that somehow turns red dirt into global purchasing power. So how did a former convict colony at the end of the world become a kind of global ATM? They call it the lucky country. But here's the detail most people never learn. The man who popularized that phrase meant it as an insult. He wasn't complimenting Australia. He was warning it. He was saying the place was run by people who didn't fully understand what they were doing, but survived anyway because they happened to be sitting on resources so massive they could cover up every mistake. And he was half right. Australia is lucky. But it's also conditioned, programmed, path-dependent in the way only a nation can be when its identity is forged in accident and repeated success. A country that learned early that you don't have to outthink the world if you can outdig it. To understand why Australia is so disgustingly wealthy today, you have to rewind to when it wasn't wealthy at all, when it was a prison. This matters psychologically. Every nation has a founding myth. The US sells the American dream. Work hard, innovate, invent, build. It's a story of progress through intelligence and hustle. Australia's founding myth is simpler, darker, almost funny in its bluntness. I hit this rock with a shovel, and now I'm rich. Australia wasn't founded by entrepreneurs. It was founded by convict petty criminals dumped at the edge of the world by the British Empire like human surplus. For decades, the economy was painfully basic. Wool, sheep. Colonial trade. Slow, stable, boring. They called it riding on the sheep's back, and that phrase tells you everything. A country clinging to an animal for economic identity. Then, in 1851, something snapped. Gold was discovered in Victoria. Not a romantic trickle. Not a few shiny flakes. Real nuggets chunks, sliding close enough to the surface that ordinary people could taste the possibility of escape. And the Victorian gold rush triggered chaos. The population of the colony surged. Ships changed routes mid-ocean to dock in Melbourne. Police, civil servants, and entire towns walked off the job to dig holes in the ground. Society didn't evolve. It frenzied, like a brain flooded with dopamine. And here's the part that still doesn't sound real. In the 1850s, the colony of Victoria alone produced a stunning share of global gold output. Not Australia. One colony. Melbourne exploded into what they called Marvelous Melbourne, a city swollen by money and manic optimism. By the late 19th century, thanks to gold and wool, Australia ranked among the richest societies per capita on Earth, rivaling or surpassing the United States in certain periods. Even while technically being a colonial appendage of the British Empire. Imagine being transported across the world in chains for stealing bread. only for your grandchildren to end up wealthier than the judge who sentenced you. That's the Australian origin story. And it did something permanent to the national psyche, because gold wasn't just wealth. It was a lesson. The world rewards extraction, not always merit, not always innovation. Sometimes the universe just puts a jackpot under your feet and dares you to believe it. The accident became a strategy. While America industrialized, Germany engineered, Britain financialized, and Japan optimized, Australia looked down, saw that its dirt was made of money, and quietly decided, we can build an identity on this. Economists usually hate this kind of economy. They even have a phrase for what should happen next: the resource curse. Most resource-rich countries get corrupted, hollow out institutions, collapse into oligarchy or dictatorship, suffer currency, volatility, and inequality until the wealth becomes a weapon used against the population. Australia dodged that fate. Not perfectly, not nobly, but functionally. It built durable institutions, a stable legal system, infrastructure that held. It didn't implode into authoritarianism, which is rare for resource colonies. Did it waste money? Of course, but it didn't destroy the state. And that difference matters, because it set the stage for the second, much larger wave of wealth. Because the easy gold eventually thinned out. By the early 20th century, the easy digging was gone. By historical logic, Australia should have peaked, plateaued, and declined. A nice, rich country that had its moment. But gold was only the appetizer. The real wealth, a kind that creates an economic force field, was buried deeper. And then, thousands of miles away, a sleeping giant woke up. A giant that would turn Australia's red dirt into a commodity shield so powerful it could absorb global crises and make Australia look unstoppable while everyone else burned. In the next section, we step into the 2000s, into the exact moment Australia accidentally got the greatest economic customer in modern history. And once you see how that relationship works, you'll understand why Australia didn't just avoid recessions. It built a shock absorber economy. If gold was the spark that ignited Australia's wealth, iron ore was the nuclear reactor that powered it into the modern era. And the timing of this jackpot is so perfect it almost feels like a rigged simulation. Picture the early 2000s. Australia is sitting on a vast, sunburnt expanse called Western Australian Area, so large it's practically a continent inside a continent. For decades, outsiders looked at it and saw nothing but flies, red dirt, and regret. A place you passed over on the way to somewhere more useful. Then, thousands of kilometers to the north, something extraordinary happened. China woke up, not gently, not cautiously, violently. China didn't decide to improve infrastructure. It decided to rebuild civilization at scale. Cities rose where farmland had been. Bridges, ports, railways, power plants, dams, highways, layer upon layer of concrete and steel poured into existence. What followed is widely regarded as the largest urbanization and infrastructure build-out in human history. And steel is the skeleton of modern civilization. To make steel, you need iron ore. And guess where a massive portion of the world's highest quality, most commercially useful iron ore was sitting? Right under that useless red dirt in Western Australia. Specifically, the Pilbara. This is the moment Australia's quiet advantage turned into a cheat code. Because geography matters in commodities. Iron ore doesn't teleport. It's heavy, bulky, and brutally expensive to transport long distances. Being closer matters. Being stable matters. Being boring matters. Australia was all three. And then came 2008. Lehman collapsed. Wall Street froze. Europe began unraveling. The global economy didn't just slow, it seized. Every country panicked. Every country except Australia. Why? Because China panicked in a very specific way. It built. In November 2008, Beijing announced a massive stimulus package, trillions in local currency, aimed squarely at infrastructure and investment. Not consumption, not social programs, concrete, steel, roads, housing. Rail. China didn't just stabilize itself. It detonated demand. And when China screamed, "We need materials now," Australia was already standing at the dock with the ships loaded. This wasn't poetry. This was logistics. While other nations debated austerity, Australia shoveled iron ore onto bulk carriers and watched money flow in. The commodity shield activated. And this wasn't small-scale mining. This was industrial extraction on a scale that borders on science fiction. Automated trains hauling iron ore across hundreds of kilometers of desert, 24/7s, with no drivers. Entire supply chains optimized to the minute. Mines that operate less like holes in the ground and more like continuous pipelines that convert geology into GDP. This isn't a metaphor, it's a machine. Now let's talk numbers, because this is where skepticism usually shows up. In recent years, Australia has exported well over $130 billion worth of iron ore annually, depending on price cycles and accounting methods. Some years higher, some years lower. Western Australia alone regularly posts iron ore sales that rival the entire exports of mid-sized countries. One rock, one commodity, an economic pillar. And here's the critical point. When your largest customer is the country undertaking the most aggressive construction spree in modern history, your economy doesn't just grow, it becomes shock-resistant. When the world slows, China builds. When China builds, Australia sells. When Australia sells, government revenue stays high, employment stays strong, and recessions get quietly postponed. This is the commodity shield in action. But here's the uncomfortable truth beneath the success story. Australia didn't design this. It didn't invent it. Didn't innovate its way into this position. It was positioned. The dirt happened to be money. The customer happened to be unstoppable. The timing happened to be perfect. That's why people call it luck. And that's also why Australians themselves have been quietly nervous about this model for decades, because luck feels great. Until you realize how dependent you've become on it. Former leaders warned about becoming too reliant on digging holes in the ground. Not because mining is bad, but because dependence is dangerous. When one customer dominates your prosperity, that customer becomes your weather system. And you don't control the weather. Which leads to the next uncomfortable question. What happens to an economy that gets really, really good at digging holes? The answer is rarely pleasant. Because while commodities make you rich, they also change what you stop doing. Economists have a name for this phenomenon, and Australia lives inside it. It's called Dutch disease, and it explains why a country can be wildly wealthy and quietly fragile at the same time. In the next section, we'll look at what Australia sacrificed for its commodity shield, what disappeared while the mines were printing money, and why digging too well can hollow out everything else. At this point, Australia looks unbeatable. Infinite demand, endless ships, a currency backed by rocks the world can't live without. A country that seemingly hacked capitalism by accident. So, where's the catch? Here's the dark joke of resource wealth. When you get very good at digging holes, you tend to forget how to do almost everything else. Economists have a term for this, and it's not flattering. They call it Dutch disease. Australia is one of the cleanest real-world examples of it. Let's strip the jargon away and explain this like adults. Here's how Dutch disease works in plain English. The world desperately wants your natural resources. To buy them, foreign customers must buy your currency. That demand pushes your currency higher and higher. A strong currency feels great until you realize what it does to everything else. A strong currency makes all other exports expensive. Manufacturing becomes uncompetitive. Skilled labor becomes overpriced. Complex goods lose margin. Factories struggle. Export industries that require precision, scale, and long planning horizons quietly die. Meanwhile, the one thing that still works: digging. Because iron ore doesn't care about exchange rates the way manufactured goods do. When global demand is strong enough, buyers swallow the currency cost. So the economy tilts. More mining, less making. More extraction, less innovation. And Australia leaned into that tilt hard. The Australian dollar, the silent assassin. During the peak of the mining boom, roughly between 2010 and 2012, the Australian dollar didn't just strengthen. It went above parity with the US dollar. For a brief, surreal moment, one Australian dollar bought more than one US dollar. If you were an Australian tourist in New York, it felt incredible. Electronics were cheap. Luxury goods were discounted. Overseas travel felt like a cheat code. But if you were an Australian manufacturer, you were already dead. Your labor costs were high. Your inputs were expensive. Your currency was too strong. You couldn't compete with producers in Asia, Europe, or North America. The market didn't debate this. It erased you. The automotive graveyard, the most brutal example of this collapse, sits rusting in Australia's industrial memory. Cars. Australia once had a real automotive industry. Not just assembly lines, but design, engineering, and local adaptation. Holden, Ford Australia, Toyota Australia. Vehicles built for Australian distances, climates, and culture. Then the mining boom peaked. The high dollar crushed export competitiveness. Imported vehicles undercut domestic production. Costs ballooned. Margins vanished. One by one, the factories shut down. Ford Australia, gone. Holden Manufacturing, gone. Toyota Manufacturing, gone. By 2017, Australia achieved a distinction that should feel impossible for a developed economy. It became the only G20 nation with zero domestic car manufacturing. Let that sink in. Australia dug up so much iron ore, the literal building block of cars, that it became uneconomical to build cars at home. That's Dutch disease in its purest form. What replaced manufacturing? The economy didn't collapse. It restored it. Mining dominated the top. Finance and banking ballooned in the middle. Services exploded at the bottom. Cafes, real estate, property management. Financial services, consumption. Australia didn't diversify. It hollowed out. Economists call this an hourglass economy, a fat top, a thin middle, and a wide base of low productivity services. And the data backs this up. There's a metric called the Economic Complexity Index. It measures how sophisticated an economy is based on what it produces and exports. Microchips versus minerals. Precision machinery versus raw inputs. Despite being rich, stable, and highly educated, Australia ranks shockingly low on this scale, often around the 90s globally. That puts it near countries with far lower incomes and far less institutional capacity. This doesn't mean Australians live poorly. It means Australia earns first-world money using a developing world economic structure. High income, low complexity, extreme exposure. The commodity shield is powerful, but it's heavy. And when it slips, it doesn't crack, it crushes. The hidden trade-off. Here's the trade Australia made, whether consciously or not. It sacrificed diversity for reliability. Instead of building fragile but sophisticated industries, it doubled down on what the world already needed in obscene quantities. Iron ore, coal, gas, later, lithium. And for decades, that trade worked beautifully. But there's a second consequence that matters even more than lost factories. Commodities don't just reshape exports, they reshape behavior. They change how capital flows. They change what banks lend against. They change what households believe is safe. And in Australia, all that capital didn't flow into new industries. It flowed somewhere else, into land. Because if you can't make things competitively, and your currency is too strong to export skill, the easiest place to park money is the one asset that never leaves the country. Houses. That's when the second engine of the Australian economy kicked into overdrive. Mining built the wealth. Housing absorbed it. And what followed wasn't just a boom. It became a belief system. In the next section, we'll look at how Australia turned shelter into a national investment strategy. Why houses began earning more than jobs, and how an entire society quietly agreed that property prices must never fall. If mining is the first engine of the Australian economy, housing is the second. And this one isn't powered by geology. It's powered by belief. Welcome to the Australian housing market, one of the most extreme property experiments in modern history. A place where a weatherboard bungalow with mold in the ceiling can cost more than a stone castle in rural Europe. Where entire dinner conversations revolve around auction results. Where weekend leisure activity isn't sport or nature, but walking through strangers' bedrooms pretending you can afford them. This didn't happen by accident. For roughly 3 decades, Australia has been running a national social experiment with one central question. What happens if we turn shelter into the primary vehicle for wealth? The answer is a housing market that has defied gravity, logic, wages, and repeated predictions of collapse for an entire generation. Let's start with the number that matters. Australian residential property is worth over odd $10 trillion depending on valuation method. Sometimes closer to $11 trillion. That's larger than the Australian stock market. Larger than domestic superannuation invested locally. Larger than commercial real estate. Roughly 4 times Australia's annual GDP. This isn't just a housing market. This is the national balance sheet. Property as a national religion. If you've spent time in Australia, you don't need data to understand this. You feel it. You go to a barbecue. Someone mentions what their neighbor's place sold for. Another person casually mentions their second investment property. Someone else jokes half-seriously that houses make more money than jobs. Open inspections replace church. Auctions replace sporting events. And this obsession didn't emerge organically. It was engineered quietly, legally, and very effectively. Negative gearing, subsidized speculation. Here's the crown jewel of Australia's housing machine. Negative gearing. In most countries, if your investment loses money, you made a bad investment. You absorb the loss. End of story. In Australia, the government steps in and says, no problem. Deduct that loss from your salary. Pay less tax. Read that again. If your rental income doesn't cover your mortgage interest and expenses, the state subsidizes the loss on the assumption that prices will rise later. Cash flow becomes irrelevant. Losses are rewarded. Capital gains become the entire strategy. This flips basic investment logic on its head. You're not punished for inefficiency. You're incentivized to leverage harder. Then came the turbocharger. The capital gains discount in 1999. Australia introduced a 50% capital gains tax discount for assets held longer than 1 year. Translation: make $1 million Australian dollars gain on property. Only $500,000 is taxed. Combine that with negative gearing and you've built the ultimate tax shelter. Doctors, lawyers, accountants, tradies, small business owners. Everyone becomes a property investor. Housing stops being shelter. It becomes a leveraged bet, optimized by the tax system. The feedback loop from hell. Here's what this created. Investors flood the market. Prices rise. First home buyers borrow more to compete. Banks lend more because prices keep rising. Rising prices justify more investor demand. Repeat for 30 years. Today, Australian households are among the most indebted in the developed world, with household debt hovering around 180 to 190% of disposable income, depending on the quarter. Australians aren't rich because they earn extraordinary wages. They feel rich because their houses inflate. Paper wealth masks fragility. This is debt-fueled prosperity. The two-tier society. This has quietly created a soft class divide. Bought property before the early 2000s? You're a genius. Your house earns more per year than your job. Born after the mid-1990s. You're locked out lest someone helps you cheat. Enter the bank of mom and dad. Parents refinance their inflated homes to fund deposits for their children. By some estimates, informal family transfers now rival major banks as sources of first home lending. Intergenerational wealth transfer, disguised as housing policy. And here's the key nuance, because this is where Australia differs from the US in 2008. Why? Australia didn't crash like America. Australia avoided a US-style housing collapse for 2 main reasons. First, conservative lending standards. Australian banks kept most mortgages on their balance sheets. Full documentation, limited subprime lending. Less securitization insanity. This made the system less explosive, but not safe. Second, political impossibility. When housing is worth $10 trillion, a price collapse isn't just a market event. It's a political catastrophe. If house prices fall, banks suffer. If banks suffer, credit freezes. If credit freezes, the economy stalls. If the economy stalls, governments lose elections. So governments feed the system. Grants, tax concessions. First home schemes. Planning bottlenecks, immigration. Housing isn't allowed to fail not because it's healthy, but because it's systemically essential. Too big to fail. But it's your backyard. The quiet contradiction, here's the paradox. Australia has abundant land, modest population density, strong construction capacity. By textbook economics, prices should stabilize. But there's one more level one that props up house prices and suppresses wages at the same time. People specifically. Imported demand. And that brings us to the next engine of Australia's prosperity. Because when you can't manufacture complexity and you've maxed out housing leverage, the fastest way to grow GDP is simple. Add more humans. In the next section, we'll look at how Australia turned immigration into economic infrastructure, why headline growth can rise while living standards fall, and how population became the quiet fuel keeping the entire system upright. So if mining prints the money and housing absorbs it, what keeps the entire system moving forward when neither can expand forever? The answer is uncomfortable in its simplicity. You add people. Welcome to the Big Australia Strategy, the quietest, most powerful growth lever in the country's economic model. For decades, Australia has run one of the most aggressive, targeted migration programs in the developed world. And despite how it's often discussed emotionally or politically, this is not chaos. It is not humanitarian randomness. It is a spreadsheet. Australia's immigration system is not built on sentiment. It is built on economic utility. Young, healthy, English-speaking. Degree in engineering, healthcare, IT, construction, or accounting. Welcome aboard. If not, thank you for your interest. This isn't a moral judgment. It's policy design. Australia doesn't import people out of kindness. It imports tax base, rent demand, labor supply, and consumption. Immigration as economic infrastructure. Think of migration the way governments think about highways or ports. It expands capacity. A new migrant doesn't need 20 years to mature into a taxpayer. They arrive as an adult. They work immediately. They rent immediately. They spend immediately. They pay tax immediately. From a GDP perspective, this is pure stimulus without the weight. And Australia leaned into this hard. In the years following COVID, Australia experienced one of the largest population surges in its modern history. Net overseas migration exceeded 500,000 people in a single year, an extraordinary number for a country of roughly 27 million. That's not gradual growth. That's adding a city larger than Canberra every year. And unlike baby booms, this growth is instant. Why the numbers look good while people feel worse? Here's the trick most people miss. Governments love to talk about headline GDP, but GDP and GDP per capita are not the same thing. Imagine the economy as a pizza. The pizza grows by 2%, but the number of people eating it grows by 4%. Everyone gets a smaller slice even, though politicians can still say the economy grew. That's not manipulation. That's accounting. And Australia has leaned on this distinction heavily. Migration props up GDP growth, keeps recession headlines away, supports tax revenues, and stabilizes debt ratios, and while wages stagnate and living costs rise. The economy looks healthy from 30,000 feet. On the ground, pressure builds. Follow the money. Where do new arrivals live? Rentals. What happens when rental demand surges faster than supply? Rents rise. Vacancy rates collapse. Who benefits? Landlords, banks, developers, governments collecting stamp duty and income tax. Who absorbs the cost? Wage earners. This is why migration is such a powerful political tool. It boosts growth without raising wages, and wage suppression is good for inflation control, corporate margins, and asset prices. It's a pressure valve that keeps the system expanding without redistributing gains evenly. The student pipeline. Human exports rebranded. Now let's talk about the most cynical and profitable variant of this strategy. International students. Education is one of Australia's largest export industries. Before the pandemic, it regularly ranked just behind iron ore, coal, and gas. Australia doesn't just sell resources, it sells degrees. Students from China, India, Nepal, and Southeast Asia pay 2 to 3 times domestic tuition. They fund university budgets, subsidize entire faculties, and keep campuses alive. In return, they receive credentials, work rights, and critically a pathway to permanent residency. It's elegant. Higher education becomes a migration filter, a revenue engine, and a population growth mechanism all at once. Learning is packaged, branded, exported. But COVID exposed the fragility. When borders closed, students vanished overnight. Rental markets in CBDs collapsed. Universities panicked. Cafes closed. Budgets bled. The system didn't break, but it wobbled. And wobbling systems reveal what's holding them up. Growth without comfort. This is the paradox of modern Australia. Mining money flows in. Housing inflates. Population grows. GDP expands. And yet, many Australians feel like they're running harder to stand still. That's because growth has been optimized for scale, not comfort. Infrastructure lags population. Housing supply lags demand. Wages lag costs. Productivity struggles to keep up. You can only add people so fast, build roads so slowly, and stretch services so thin before something strains. And yet, Australia still has one final pillar, one so boring, so compulsory and so powerful that it quietly stabilizes everything else. A system built in the 1990s that forces money into markets whether people like it or not. A national piggy bank so large it distorts gravity. It's called superannuation, and it might be the most underappreciated economic weapon Australia has. In the final section, we'll look at how compulsory savings created a $3.9 trillion financial fortress, why Australia accidentally built a sovereign wealth fund without calling it one, and what happens when forced compounding meets a slowing world. If mining is Australia's geological cheat code and housing is its financial religion, then superannuation is the quiet machine humming underneath everything boring, compulsory, and unbelievably powerful. This is the part of the story that rarely makes headlines, partly because it isn't dramatic, and partly because it works so well that people forget how unusual it is. In most countries, retirement saving is optional, fragmented, and fragile. In Australia, it's mandatory. And that single decision changed everything. Forced saving at national scale in the late 1980s and early 1990s, Australian policymakers faced a brutal arithmetic problem. People were living longer. Birth rates were falling. A traditional generous state pension would eventually bankrupt the country. Instead of promising future taxpayers they'd figure it out later, Australia chose a different path. It forced people to save. Superannuation, usually just called super, requires employers to contribute a fixed percentage of every worker's wage into a locked investment account in the worker's name. Today, that rate sits at 11.5%, rising to 12%. You cannot opt out. Your employer cannot opt out. You generally cannot touch the money until retirement. At 20 years old, it feels like theft. At 60, it feels like sorcery. Fast forward 3 decades. Australia, with a population of just 27 million, now controls roughly odd $3.9 trillion in retirement assets. That makes it the 4th largest pension system on Earth, behind only the United States, Japan, and the UK, countries with vastly larger populations. This is not normal. This is forced compounding at nation scale. A permanent bid under the market. Here's where it gets interesting. Every single month, workers get paid. Employers contribute to super. Billions of dollars must be invested. Super funds don't get to say, markets look scary, let's sit in cash. They are legally structured to deploy capital. As do they buy? Australian banks, mining companies, utilities, airports, toll roads, infrastructure, commercial property, global equities. This creates something close to a structural demand floor under financial markets. Not a guarantee, not immunity, but a powerful stabilizer. During the 2008 financial crisis and the 2020 COVID crash, Australian markets still fell, but they didn't seize. While retail investors panicked, super contributions kept flowing. Liquidity didn't vanish. Capital didn't disappear. Fire sales were softened. Australia didn't avoid shocks, it absorbed them. Accidental collective ownership. Here's the irony most people miss. Australian workers technically own large chunks of the economy through super banks, miners, infrastructure, toll roads, utilities. In theory, this is mass capital ownership. In practice, it's filtered through fund managers, index providers, and global asset managers BlackRock, Vanguard, State Street, who make decisions on behalf of millions of passive owners. It's not socialism. It's accidental collectivism via capitalism. Workers own the assets. Institutions control them. And as super pools grew too large for the domestic economy, they spilled outward. Australian retirement money now owns airports in London, toll roads in North America, ports in Europe, utilities across Asia. Australia didn't just build a pension system. It built a de facto sovereign wealth fund without calling it one. The hidden risk: too much money, too few places to put it, but no system is free of trade-offs. $3.9 trillion is enormous relative to Australia's economic size. There aren't enough productive domestic assets to absorb it efficiently forever. So super funds go global. That brings diversification, but also exposure. Markets must remain liquid. Global capital flows must function. Politics must not fracture the system. Superannuation is brilliant, but it is not magic. It is leverage spread across generations. The final synthesis: now step back and look at the full picture. Australia got rich by sitting on obscene natural resources, selling them to a booming Asia, financializing housing into a wealth escalator. Importing people to sustain growth, forcing savings to stabilize capital markets, monetizing geography through alliances. This is not innovation-led prosperity. It is position-led prosperity. Luck, timing, geography, policy, and here's the uncomfortable truth. It worked. Australians enjoy one of the highest minimum wages in the world, universal healthcare, political stability, long life expectancy, beaches, safety, and institutions that mostly function. That comfort reduces urgency. When life is good enough, radical reinvention feels unnecessary. That's why critics warn Australia risks becoming the lazy country, consuming its inheritance instead of compounding it, exporting rocks while importing complexity. And they may be right. Australia ranks low on economic complexity. Manufacturing is thin. Innovation clusters narrowly around mining services, finance, and property. But here's the counterpoint. If you're standing on Bondi Beach with compulsory retirement savings, a stable democracy, and one of the safest passports on earth, the fear of future decline feels abstract. They say it's better to be lucky than smart. Australia may be proof that it's best to be lucky first and smart enough to monetize it before the cycle turns. Because luck doesn't last forever. But it lasts a lot longer if you know how to extract every advantage from it.